Hey Rowan, this is another traditional song. I think I first heard it on Sesame Street. It's a sort of conversation between two people. So you have a guy and a girl, and the guy starts out, "There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what? With a plug, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a plug, dear Henry, dear Henry, a plug. The plug's too large, dear Liza, dear Liza. The plug's too large, dear Liza, too large. Well, cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, an axe. The axe is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. The axe is too dull, dear Liza, too dull. Well, sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, sharpen it. With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what? With a whetstone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a whetstone, dear Henry, dear Henry, a whetstone. The whetstone's too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The whetstone's too dry, dear Liza, too dry. Well, wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water. Shall I fetch the water, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix the water, dear Liza? With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, a bucket. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. So, that's a song, list of problems. Each problem causes a circular reaction, so you can't even fix the hole in the bucket because you can't make the plug, because the axe is too dull, the whetstone's too dry, nothing to fetch water to wet the whetstone. Now, this doesn't really work because one, whetstones are often used dry. Two, whetstone is Whetstone. So, from Old English wet to sharpen. So you have this sort of roundabout thing that sounds like it works but doesn't quite work, but it works in English and possibly other languages. But anyway, that's a hole in the bucket, and that's one of those things that I often use. It's like, oh, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. And, everyone knows, or a lot of people know that, and that it's this long series of problems that end up recurring. Um, this is second cousin to the yak shaving problem. Yak shaving is a term in computer science and engineering where you have to fix a whole bunch of different little things to get the big problem solved. And there's a story that's like a guy wants to trim the hedges. In order to trim the hedges, he needs a new hedge trimmer. In order to get the hedge trimmer, he has to go across the Tappan Zee Bridge. In order to go across the Tappan Zee Bridge, he needs a E-ZPass. He lent his E-ZPass to the neighbor. The neighbor lent him a pillow stuffed with yak hair. So he has to repair the pillow to give it back to the neighbor in order to get the E-ZPass, in order to get the hedge trimmer, in order to trim the hedges. And the story ends up in between this and that, I ended up in the zoo in the middle of the night shaving a yak. Totally Not true, never happened to anybody, but the idea is that you have this problem and another problem and another problem and another problem and another problem. The hole in the bucket is different because the problems are recursive. That one problem causes another problem, and you end up back at the first problem that you were trying to solve in the first place. Yak shaving is slightly different, that while you go down that big long list of problems, you end up with something that seems unrelated, but actually ties back to everything. So that is a hole in the bucket and yak shaving. Two things that you never thought would be related to each other. I guess maybe if you were to shave a yak, you would need a lot of lather. A bucket would be the appropriate thing to mix up the shaving cream in, as opposed to like a little cup. Not that I know much about shaving.